Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're diving into something truly fascinating, the intersection of advanced AI discovery and biomedicine. We're going to explore the massive potential of the energetic paradigm, and as you'll see, medicine isn't just some generic application for this framework. It might actually be the ultimate test of it. We are talking about a monumental shift in how we think, moving from seeing a disease as just a single, isolated, broken part, to really understanding it as a highly dynamic, self-sustaining system.
Okay, so here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The biomedical challenge, 2. Disease as a dynamic system, 3. Minimum sustaining structure, 4. Target discovery and repurposing, 5. An energetic diagnosis, and finally, 6. The verification ladder. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Biomedical Challenge. Let's look at exactly why general models just cannot simply enter the field and solve arbitrary problems. Biomedicine is incredibly domain-specific. You absolutely cannot just take a general AI model, throw it at a massive biological dataset, and expect it to spit out actionable cures. It just doesn't work that way. To make any real progress, you need highly specialized scientific knowledge, access to the right data, and real experimental capabilities. On top of that, you need clinical interpretation to know if a finding actually matters to a real living patient, plus incredibly strong verification. This is exactly why dedicated teams are absolutely necessary just to figure out which specific questions are even suitable for AI-led discovery in the first place.
Moving on to Section 2, disease as a dynamic system. Biology is definitely not a clean collection of independent variables. Biological systems are constantly changing, intertwined networks of interactions. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates why a seemingly small, local intervention often has massive, completely unintended consequences. When a disease takes hold, it involves this crazy complex web. Molecular interactions trigger cellular signaling, tissues respond, the immune system adapts, and powerful feedback loops develop across time. A disease often persists not because one single component is permanently broken, but because the entire system has essentially reorganized itself into a self-sustaining pathological state.
And this brings us to an incredibly important distinction: the initiating cause versus the maintaining cause. The initiating cause, the original trigger that started the whole disease process, might actually disappear entirely over time, but the disease just keeps going. Why? Because of the maintaining cause. Things like feedback loops, sensitization, immune activation, metabolic pressure, or compensatory mechanisms take over. They start independently reproducing the condition. If you only design a treatment around that initial trigger after the disease is already fully established, well, the treatment might completely fail because the system has already moved on. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, minimum sustaining structure. This captures the core philosophy of the energetic paradigm.
So what does this all mean? Well, this right here is the central probing question of the energetic paradigm. Instead of just asking, hey, which molecule interacts with this target, it takes a huge step back. It asks, what structure continues to supply the pressure, the resources, the signaling, and the control required to keep the disease active? This completely flips how we view treatment. We aren't just hunting for a single broken part anymore. We're looking for the flows and forces that are actively keeping the disease alive.
Now look at the stark contrast on this slide. Conventional target matching basically finds a marker associated with the disease and just hits it with a drug. But here's the catch. A biological target might be strongly associated with a disease, but still have almost zero structural leverage. It might just be a downstream marker, right? A visible symptom, a correlated signal, or maybe just a component that another pathway can easily replace. So you might improve one specific lab measurement, but the actual disease system continues perfectly intact. In contrast, the structural disease model asks, what role does the target play in sustaining the disease? What feedback loop is it supporting? What compensatory pathway might just replace it? It aims to disrupt the entire pathological system and force it into a different, healthy, stable state, rather than just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom.
To actually put this into practice, the framework focuses on identifying what's called the minimum sustaining structure. Think of this as the absolute smallest set of mechanisms required to keep that pathological state active. By identifying this core structure, you can figure out which mechanism is the true driver, which component gives you the greatest leverage, which feedback loop absolutely must be interrupted, and what exact sequence of interventions might be required to finally heal the system.
Let's see how this actually works out in the real world in Section 4, Target Discovery and Repurposing.
The source material identifies 4 core biomedical areas where this paradigm could just be incredibly valuable. Now, let's be super clear up front. We are not claiming this framework has already magically produced validated cures. Not at all. Rather, these are the initial domains where organizing all this fragmented biological evidence around the mechanisms that sustain disease has the absolute highest potential for impact.
So when it comes to discovering new targets, we can't just rank them by statistical association or their immediate local biological effect. They have to be evaluated by structural leverage. A really great target might actually have a smaller local effect, but if it weakens a reinforcing loop, removes a critical bottleneck, or shifts the whole system across the threshold back into a healthy state, well, it is structurally far more valuable. This beautifully explains why some seemingly promising drugs totally fail in trials. A target might show a strong effect in the lab, but occupy a really weak position in the larger disease system. Meanwhile, another target might have a tiny local effect, but control a critical system-wide structural relationship.
And this brings us to drug repurposing. Finding entirely new uses for existing drugs. This is an incredibly attractive starting point. The pharmacology is already known, the manufacturing processes exist, you have partial safety evidence, and the path to experimental testing is so much shorter. But the key here isn't just finding a neat statistical match. An existing drug might be useful because it alters the actual environment that sustains the disease. Maybe it reduces a vital resource the pathology relies on, interrupts a compensation pathway, or suddenly makes another treatment effective. The system has to explain exactly why the drug alters that sustaining structure.
All right, moving right along to Section 5, an energetic diagnosis, where we look beneath the traditional disease label.
Imagine 4 patients walk into a clinic, and they all get the exact same diagnostic label. But that label only describes the surface pattern. It completely misses the active causal structure underneath. Patient A's condition might actually be sustained by immune activation, while patient B's is driven by metabolic pressure. Patient C's is neural amplification, and patient D's is a continuing environmental input. An energetic diagnosis doesn't just slap a label on you, it asks what specific system is currently maintaining this individual patient's condition right now.
Because medicine rarely, if ever, gives us complete information up front, diagnosis and treatment essentially become a closed loop. You observe, you form a hypothesis, and then you intervene. But in this paradigm, the intervention actually acts as a diagnostic probe into the system. It asks which inputs are still active, which loops have become self-sustaining, which compensations are going to resist this treatment. You measure the response, update your structural model based on what just happened, and then select your next action. It's a beautifully controlled, dynamic learning process.
Finally, we reach Section 6, the verification ladder, because a coherent mechanism is not yet a validated treatment.
We have to be incredibly careful about the danger of excessive complexity here. Just because an AI can weave together a bunch of facts into a brilliant, coherent causal narrative does not mean it's right. If it hasn't been experimentally established in the real world, it is nothing more than an insightful hypothesis. Plausible reasoning alone is absolutely 100% insufficient in medicine.
So any claim generated by this paradigm must move through progressively stronger levels of evidence. It starts with biological consistency and published evidence, sure, but then it has to move through retrospective data and rigorous lab testing. Ultimately, it must survive strict clinical studies and long-term outcome replication. We can never, ever confuse an internally coherent hypothesis with a fully validated treatment.
And for this framework to be truly scientific and not just, a fancy new way of speaking, its concepts have to be measurable. We can't just rely on metaphors. We have to be able to actually quantify flow, measure feedback, estimate structural leverage, detect compensation, and identify the exact thresholds that separate one stable biological state from another. That is the true engineering challenge we're looking at here.
And that leaves us with this final, decisive question. Can this framework actually produce hypotheses that are more testable, more discriminating, and more clinically useful than our conventional approaches? That is where the real proof has to happen. Medicine isn't just a cool application for the energetic paradigm. It is arguably the strongest, most demanding environment to test the paradigm itself. It's a fascinating structural approach that could literally change how we understand healing from the ground up. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and keep questioning the structure of things.